Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. Hope you guys had a good week. Let's take a look at chapter 15. Just a few things in terms of the last few things with this unit. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. Deals with a lot of stuff in terms of social issues. So let's take a look. So chapter 15 focuses on a lot, like on in terms of the growth of like religion. One of the things that plays a big role is a book written by Thomas Paine called The Age of Reason. In this book, he essentially focuses on sort of a philosophy that had already existed in Europe, and it was something called deism, which eventually leads to the founding of the Unitarian faith. Essentially, what it argues, the deist philosophy, is that one of the greatest gifts that God gave us, right, was this idea of reason. That what separates us from other animals is reason, and it is through reason that we are able to decipher some of the meanings of life. And so it's sort of like a scientific sort of Christian principle. Thomas Jefferson, considered a deist, he actually, I'll talk a little bit about this in class, about the Jeffersonian Bible. But it's a really interesting look at the way that Jefferson approaches the Bible. We'll talk about that in class. So the deists, they believe that God existed, but that God was a clockmaker, essentially creates and governs the universe, not the way that we see where God is involved in every single thing that we do. So again, they believe that God gave humans the ability to reason, which separates us from other animals. The deists, again, the deist philosophy leads to the founding of the Unitarian Church. And so they rejected the idea of original sin. So they do not believe this whole idea of like Adam and Eve and that the apple was eaten and then that's why there's sin. Said that they believe that humans have the capability to do both good and bad. But a lot of it has to do with how the environment that we are raised in. The deists reject the idea of the Holy Trinity, that Jesus is both, or I shouldn't just say both, but that Jesus is the Lord, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Believe that Jesus' life consisted of a how to live guide. So in other words, Jesus was not this God, but simply a really awesome human being. They believe in free will, and they believe that the authors of the Bible were human and subject to human error. And one of the really important things, too, is they believe that no religion had the right to claim a monopoly over God. So one of the things that happens is because there was a growth in like sort of rational religious feeling, one of the things that we're going to see is the Second Great Awakening. It was larger than the first, spread through camp meetings, again, very similar. So because more and more people were getting farther and farther away from religion, and because there was this whole new sort of movement of rational religion, there's going to be a new explosion in terms of the Second Great Awakening and trying to get people back into the old way of looking at things. So the result of all of this was boosted church membership, led to many humanitarian reform movements. You get the Methodists and the Baptists, benefited the most because they stress this emotionalism, personal conversion rather than predestination, which became really, really important. So like many more people wanting to be a part of religion because of that reason. One of the people that was really important was a guy by the name of Peter Cartwright. He was best known through the Methodist circles as like the circuit rider. He would come around and again lead these sort of campfire meetings. Probably the most famous of the Second Great Awakening preachers was Charles Finney. He was considered the greatest of the revival preachers. He called for a perfect Christian kingdom on earth. He led to many reform efforts, things like reforming the idea of like drinking alcohol, trying to abolish slavery. And one of the things that he did to get a lot more people back into church was he opened church membership up to women. So he said that women should be included in the membership process. So Western New York became known as the burned over district. We'll talk a little bit about that in class. Many new religions as a result of that. The Adventists, which predicted Christ's return, and this has actually happened many times where you have these different religions that will predict the return of Christ. Like the first Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening widened the gap between the classes and religion, in terms of like poor people following less rational religions versus like more intelligent people following more rational religions. Rich and conservative Eastern denominations were not as affected. People like the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Congregational, Unitarians. The Methodists and the Baptists, they drew from the poorer classes in the South and the West. And again, one of the things that we'll see that's going to become really important is the split of the churches over the view of slavery. This man that you see in the picture here, this is a guy by the name of Lehman Beecher. He's going to become really important, right? Because his daughters, his children, will become really important in terms of lots of reform movements. As a result of the sort of burned over district of New York, in the 1830s, produced a new sort of prophet, a man by the name of Joseph Smith, who claimed to have received the Word of God, and so he created his book. It's called the Book of Mormon. Believed in cooperation, polygamy, sort of a militia which created conflict with neighbors in like Ohio and Missouri. He eventually moved there. In 1846, after Smith was murdered in the Midwest, Brigham Young led the Church of Latter-day Saints to Utah. Utah grew quickly from the Latter-day Saints, and one of the things that helped them grow too was the European immigration. They are going to eventually have a lot of conflict with the federal government over territorial control, right? And of course polygamy. That's why Utah is one of the last ones to be included in the Union, because they would not give up their whole philosophy on polygamy. And so that's going to play a very major role. So the early public schools were only for the poor, but came to be viewed by rich as necessary for a stable democracy. So they pushed for the whole push for public school. 1825 to 1850, public schooling grew due to white manhood suffrage. So as more men got the right to vote, they are going to begin to push for more education of their children. The quality of early schools was very sporadic, needed reform. So you see this picture here, this man here, guy by the name of Horace Mann. So he was part of the Massachusetts Board of Education. He is called the father of public education because he argued for longer terms, so that the kids should be in school longer, better pay for teachers, and a more broader curriculum to actually be able to teach things like math and English and things like that. Despite Horace Mann, there were only 100 public secondary schools by 1860. Education, again, was seen a luxury for many. This man here, Noah Webster, provided improved textbooks. He is the guy that standardized the American language, right, the English language for the U.S., into his famous dictionary. And again, just taking a look at his... University of Virginia was founded in 1819. It was the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, dedicated to freedom from denominational control. Taught many things like modern languages and science. Women, higher education was frowned upon, but some schools developed in the 1820s and 1830s. 1837, Oberlin College in Ohio allowed women and had previously also allowed blacks. To this day, it's still considered one of the most liberal schools in the country, Oberlin College. Adult education was also growing through what was called the Lyceum Lecture. And so essentially just like, in a sense, like the Greeks, right? Just having these like lecture halls out in the open where people would come and listen to these lectures. You began to see also magazines begin to flourish and people reading more. So various reform campaigns were also developed, most as a result of the Second Great Awakening. The Puritan vision of perfect society fueled crusades against things like war, alcohol, discrimination, and slavery. State legislatures gradually abolished debtors' prisons as a result of these reforms. Capital offenses and brutal punishments were reduced. The idea that prisons should reform rather than just punish grew. And again, this is going to be because of people. Dorothea Dix led reforms to improve the treatment of the mentally ill. In 1843, she petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to get more rights to the people that were mentally ill. William Ladd led peace movement. American Peace Society was formed in 1828. Alcohol was a huge problem, even among women, clergy, problem at weddings, funeral work. In 1826, the American Temperance Society was formed in Boston. Thousands others followed. An anti-alcohol novel called 10 Nights in a Barroom was bestseller in the 1850s. Moderate reformers stressed the idea of temperance and moderation rather than abstinence, but others favored prohibition. The first state to actually ban alcohol was Maine, and it was because of this man here, Neil Dow. He's considered a reformer. He is the father of prohibition. So in 1851, They banned alcohol in Maine. Other states also followed, but many laws were struck down or ignored. However, drinking was reduced overall during this time as a result. It isn't going to be again until till 1918 that we 1919, excuse me, that we'll see the 18th Amendment that is going to be ratified, which abolishes or creates prohibition. Women had few rights, but treated better. They were still treated better than most of the women in Europe, partly due to their scarcity on the frontier. There were many. One of the things that we saw, which we still see today, right, is that essentially these gender roles, especially when it came to economics, they were seen as homemakers, right? Again, the cult of domesticity sort of glorifies that. Mid-century, more women became involved in reform movements, women's rights, temperance, slavery. Elizabeth Cady Stanton advocated for women's suffrage, right? Susan B. Anthony was a militant lecturer, very progressive. Women were called Susie B's because of her. But again, just advocating for women's rights. 1848, feminist reform led to the meeting at Seneca Falls, New York, the Second Seneca Falls Convention. There, the women, they wrote the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, declared that all men and women are created equal, demanded suffrage, and significance is that it launched the modern women's rights movement. One of the things that also became very popular this time was trying to create perfect societies, these utopians. Sir Thomas More, right, who was the teacher of Henry VIII, he wrote a book called Utopia, and again, trying to advocate for a perfect society. One of the more famous ones was New Harmony. A guy by the name of Robert Owen. There was Brook Farm. Many of them were transcendentalists, but again, many of these failed. One of the most successful ones was the Oneida one. It was very complex. One of the things that they stressed, though, was eugenics, trying to essentially create the perfect kids. You had the Shakers in 1770s. Again, just many different, like these little utopian societies began to spring up, trying to create perfect societies. One of the things that we began to see during this time, too, is a lot of the literature that is going to come about. And a part of why is because as a result of the War of 1812, a lot more of the literature became a lot more nationalistic. So nationalism, like I said, right? So one of the groups that emerged was this Knickerbocker group out of New York, producing some of the first sort of American literature. Guy by the name of Washington Irving became one of the first truly American writers. James Fenimore Cooper, William Cullen Bryant. So again, some of these famous writers. One of the movements that became a very famous literature movement during this time was, of course, the Transcendentalists. They rejected the idea that knowledge only came through the senses, but that each of us had an inner light to share. Led to social and religious individualism, self-reliance, self-discipline, again, because we each had it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, probably the most famous former minister, writer, speaker. He would go out and do a lot of the Lyceum lectures. He gave a speech called The American Scholar, urged Americans to have intellectual independence from Europe. So again, this idea of my favorite of the Transcendentalists, of course, is Henry David Thoreau. Like Emerson, he opposed slavery, developed ideas of civil disobedience. He was a very gifted writer. He wrote Walden, described the idea of a simple life. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about them in class. Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass, a collection of poetry. He was the poet laureate of America, described love for masses, the expansion of America. He was also gay. Henry Longfellow, popular poet both in the U.S. and Europe, popular work based on American themes. John Whittier, poet laureate of anti-slavery effort. James Lowell, great poet, essayist, political satirist, condemned slavery, expansion of Polk. We'll talk about that in the next. Oliver Wendell Holmes saw Boston as a central poet, essayist, novelist. Louisa May Alcott, she wrote Little Women. Emily Dickinson, right? She was a recluse. Again, a lot of her stuff didn't get published until after her death. William Sims, he was sort of seen as the Cooper of the South. 82 books, again, Southern themes. Some writers were not always about all of these good things. Edgar Allan Poe has sort of led a miserable existence, and he wrote a lot about dire situations. And of course, one of the most famous things that he wrote was The Raven. Nathaniel Hawthorne, writing a lot about Massachusetts, puritanical sort of influences. One of his most famous books called The Scarlet Letter. Herman Melville, the adventurer. Moby Dick was not initially popular, most likely more upbeat novels, and he unfortunately died in poverty. So again, just kind of taking a look at some of the things that were happening socially during this time in chapter 15.